Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
A warm welcome to all of you joining us in the United States and the world over. Newt Gingrich, Edward Penton, Father Gerald Murray, and the Bishop of Cordova are all straight ahead. If you'd like to comment on tonight's show, you can send me a question. I'll be live tweeting throughout. You can find me on Twitter at Raymond Arroyo, or you can email us at worldover@ewtn.com. Let's get right to it. The special counsel investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election and possible obstruction by the president continues. And Washington is still in shock over last week's attempted assassination of Louisiana Congressman Steve Scalise and others. In the midst of all this chaos, is the administration's agenda getting lost? Here to give us his take on all this and much more is former Speaker of the House and author of the new book, Understanding Trump. Would you welcome Newt Gingrich back to the program?
Good to be with you.
Great to see you again, Newt. Let's start with this Russia investigation. There seems to be an endless cascade of these leaks coming from the intelligence agencies. How would you address this if you were sitting in the Oval Office? Somebody has got to stop these leaks. They're driving the news cycle.
I mean, technically, the FBI should be tracking down the leakers, and they should face going to jail. I mean, if what they're leaking is classified, it's as Secretary Kelly, former Marine four-star general, said the other day, it verges on treason to watch some of these people release things that are going to get Americans killed. They're going to get our agents killed. But in addition, it's important to remember, this all starts with the Clinton people trying to explain why they lost. And they said, well, it couldn't have been us. Trump couldn't beat us. It must have been the Russians. And so the whole left picked up this thematic of the Russians did something. Now, in 6 months of looking, they can't find anything. So now the new special investigator is saying, well, maybe I'm going to actually be looking at obstruction of justice. So now we're mutating. It used to be the Russians. Now it's going to be Comey and Trump. If that doesn't work, it's going to be something else.
But Newt, you who oversaw the 1998 special counsel when it was Ken Starr, you know this is how special investigators roll. They start looking at this, suddenly you end up with a Gap dress at the end of the day. These things transmute. Why didn't he fire Comey right after the election? Would that have been the more opportune time to do it?
It would have been the right time to do it. I think because I'm working on a piece right now on 3 crises, and all of them are the same night, between 8 o'clock and 11 o'clock on election night. At 8 o'clock, the left knows they're going to win, and they know that Hillary Clinton is going to be president and that she is going to appoint liberal judges to the Supreme Court. They're going to continue to impose radicalism on America by the power of law, and things are fine. By 11 o'clock, they've lost not just a normal Republican, they've lost to Donald J. Trump. Well, they've never gotten over the catharsis of that shocking moment. I mean, they're still today trapped in this crisis. The Republicans had the same problem. I mean, Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, none of these guys expected to be governing. They were never ready for this. They didn't think Trump was going to win. They didn't think through what would a Trumpian presidency be. But Trump had the same problem. This is the 3rd crisis. Trump campaigned his heart out, was the underdog all the way through, and on election night, as he's winning, for the very first time, he's beginning to think about governing. Now, Reagan had 16 years to prepare.
Right.
I had 16 years before I became Speaker. Trump had 15 months. So you're right looking back. The right moment to fire Comey would have been like the 21st of January with everybody else. And it would have been a much smaller problem. But Trump is still, and this is part of why I wrote Understanding Trump, Trump is a work in progress. Trump doesn't fit any of our understanding of how presidents operate because he's a pure entrepreneur and he's having to learn all this as he's doing it.
Well, you make the point in the book that he is really, that he's not just a media practitioner, he's a master of the media.
He really is.
And that is true. But one has to say, James Comey is giving him a real run for his money, and so is these intelligence agents dripping this information out because they've realized to counter Trump, you leak things to the Washington Post and the New York Times, and you can drive and control the news cycle. Is that a smart strategy from their perspective?
Oh, absolutely.
How do you counter it?
You do a little bit of what Reagan did. You focus on really big things, and you pound away at them, and you break through. The truth is, if Trump ends up with the economy growing, with the kind of opportunities we have in infrastructure to build a new America, with the different things he's doing, he'll get reelected. It'll drive the left crazy, but he'll get reelected. And I think that in the end, he's got to focus on big things. I think on the smaller things, he's got to get. He's a little bit like a quarterback who refuses to either have a huddle so the team knows what the game is, or to stay behind his offensive line so they can block for him. I mean, he's constantly running out ahead of everybody else.
With the tweets and everything else.
And so he's much more in the fight that he needs to be. He could be above about 80% of this.
I want to read something to you from one of your former colleagues, former Representative Bob Inglis, and he wrote in the Washington Post this week, "I helped draft Clinton's impeachment articles. The charges against Trump are more serious. Clinton was impeached for charges less serious than the ones before us now. In the current case, Comey was exploring the possibility of American involvement in the Russian plot, a treasonous offense." What do you make of this?
I think he's wrong. And the reason I think he's wrong is because Trump didn't do anything to the Russian investigation. They haven't cut off any money. They haven't given any new instructions. All of the FBI agents who are investigating are still investigating. He fired Comey. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, does the President of the United States, as the chief executive, have the authority to fire the FBI director? The answer is unequivocally yes, of course he does. So this is everybody makes these assumptions. If Trump had reached out and shut down the FBI investigation in order to protect people on his team, that would be obstruction.
It's a kind of silly way to shut it down, because the minute you get a new FBI director, they're going to continue the
investigation. No, they are anyway. They're continuing all the way through. And then the point is, Trump said, "I want you to continue the investigation." He didn't try to stop it. So in that sense, I think Inglis is misreading what Trump was actually doing. He was firing one person.
I spoke to a member of Congress, a long-serving GOP member of Congress, last week at a dinner. And he told me from inside he feels there is not a real urgency to move this Trump agenda forward. And the Democrats at this point have decided to defect in place. They are not going to support even one vote. With even things like flood bills and general reforms that need the work of government must continue. What is your analysis of this as you watch as a former speaker?
Well, first of all, I think it's not accurate to say they're not voting yes occasionally. They just passed a veterans reform bill with a huge bipartisan majority. Earlier, they had passed some other bills with big bipartisan majorities. They're not passing the big stuff.
The Trump agenda.
But let's start with a simple point. You cannot go to a Democrat to repeal Obamacare. I mean, this was the signature issue of President Obama, and any Democrat who voted to repeal it would get a primary opponent immediately. The other point I'd make is, and this is something Trump hasn't quite learned yet, Reagan's genius was not negotiating with Congress. Reagan's genius was communicating with the American people so they would negotiate with Congress. The morning Trump learns to focus most of his tweets on his program and to communicate in North Dakota or in Missouri or in Indiana, where there are Democrats up for re-election next year in a state Trump carried, you will suddenly see Democrats in the Senate decide they have to vote with Trump, because otherwise they're not going to get reelected.
What would you do if you were Speaker right now, in this moment? How would you galvanize your caucus, and what do you think of the job Paul Ryan is doing?
I think Paul's doing a good job. I think Paul's very smart. I think there are two things Republicans don't know how to do. They don't know how to communicate.
Only two?
There are two big things they don't know how to. They don't know how to communicate, so that they're continually behind the curve in explaining what they're doing. And they're not good at fighting. The Republicans like an orderly, neat world where we're all going to get together and be nice. Well, if you're a transformational leader, I used to say to Trump, you got to remember, if you're going to drain the swamp, the alligators will be unhappy. And it's a simple decision. You don't want the alligators to be unhappy, don't drain the swamp. But if you're going to drain the swamp, they're going to bite you.
Yeah, and you've got to fight them off. Let's talk for a moment. I'd love your perspective on this. As I watch the Steve Scalise shooting this past week, we're seeing these London attacks. What is happening in the world and in politics today? Has it become so toxic? You in your book called it toxic identity politics. Is that what's driving so much of this?
Yeah, a lot of it is that people see this as the end of their way of life, whichever side you're on.
That's how it's being depicted.
Yeah, whichever side you're on. And so, and I think some of it's real. I also included in Understanding Trump an essay on the Second American Civil War by Dennis Prager, which is a very profound and very serious essay. I talk to college students all the time who feel intimidated on campus. I talked to two young ladies at Cornell when I was up there, and they were young Republicans, and they said that for a week after the election, you couldn't laugh or smile because you'd get yelled at because it was inappropriate to be happy when Hillary Clinton had been defeated. I mean, that kind of stuff. So I do think there's an intensity we have not. I think if you go back to the Vietnam era, you'll see a similar kind of intensity, but not since then have we had this level of intensity.
Are you worried about the politicization of everything, from sports to theater to music? There's no common ground for Americans anymore.
Well, look, I'm only worried about in the sense that I think we have to defeat it. I mean, I think we have to say at some point, everything, and this is, by the way, I think hurt ESPN's ratings, for example.
Right.
I mean, people get tired of being yelled at by people they don't agree with. So I think going back to a more normative America, that's only going to happen when one side or the other wins. I mean, right now we're in a very close balance of power between two radically different interpretations of America. And so for either one of them, it is literally identity politics. It's if my side loses, I will cease to have a place.
But the violence that we've seen in recent days.
Well, and I thought it was very telling, though. For example, the people doing the Shakespeare play at public taxpayers' money in public theater in New York, they couldn't even bend enough to put a black wig on the actor for the last two shows after the shooting. They just couldn't. The rigidity. So when people say to me, "Gee, I hope we learn from this," as a historian, I am very doubtful that we're going to learn much.
Let's talk about Syria for a moment, which could be the proxy war coming. It may already be in that place. You had the Americans shooting down a Syrian warplane. Now the Russians are saying, we will be tracking even any coalition jet, including an American jet, that enters anything west of the Euphrates. Are you concerned about this playing out and falling apart?
I'm a little concerned. I mean, look, first of all, the Russians have a doctrine that includes tactical use of nuclear weapons. So you have to always be worried about the Russians. Second, it depends on what if they mean, for example, if an American airplane crosses the Euphrates, they're going to be tracked by radar, which would be tied to an anti-aircraft missile.
Right.
That's the next step up in tension. But as long as they don't fire the missile, I don't frankly care. I think the Russians will think very long and hard before they start attacking American aircraft, partially because in Syria we'd wipe them out. I mean, they have no capacity to sustain power against us in Syria. And I think that would, now, the danger is, does that lead to escalation?
Right.
But they can't maintain ships in the Mediterranean without our permission. They can't maintain air power in Syria without our permission. So if they really were to go to the next stage, and I suspect people like General Mattis are explaining this to them,
right,
that if they really want to test this theory out, we'll simply wipe out their entire force.
Well, I read a story the other day where you have two individuals, at least, in the national security apparatus that want us to go hand-to-hand with the Iranians who are there fighting on part of al-Bashar. General Mattis and others are saying, no, we're not going that far.
I don't think we want to get involved in trying to knock off Bashar Assad. That's a bigger challenge. But the Syrian Air Force was bombing pro-American forces who were beginning to conquer Raqqa, which is the headquarters of ISIS. And I think we said, hold on, you can't come across and attack our forces. And so they're going to have to work out some kind of living agreement here, or it could get very messy.
In the book, you talk about Trump appreciating and prizing speed over avoidance of mistakes. As you watch this play out in these early months, a lot of mistakes have been made, a lot of cross currents. One person saying, the president's lawyer saying one thing, the president saying another, Sean Spicer saying one thing, the president saying another. What would be your advice to him? My advice would be to slow down a little bit. I go back to the idea, if you're a quarterback with a really big team, it's useful to get in the huddle. Which means you got to slow down. And have a plan before you start. You got to have a plan, and then you have to let the other people in the plan do their jobs. Trump is so energetic and he's so enthusiastic that he literally runs past everybody else. And he is so prone to operate intuitively and this is why the book's not called Predicting Trump. I don't think it's possible to predict Trump because I don't think he can predict Trump.
I think he responds intuitively as he gets new information.
Yeah, yeah, and he's very practical. I mean, he's very practical and in the moment. Give me a sense. We heard that Kalista Gingrich, your wife, has been nominated as the U.S. ambassador to the Holy See. Are you and she taking the Berlitz courses now? You're boning up on your Italian?
Let me just say that she is extraordinarily honored to have been asked by President Trump to represent the United States at the Vatican. She is studying like crazy, as you and I talk, in order to go through the Senate confirmation process. I will say, because you're an old friend, in July I have blocked in 4 days, and I am taking the spouse course.
Oh.
So I will report later on what I learn as a spouse.
Oh.
But it's an adventure you couldn't quite imagine. As you know, Rome is the eternal city. It's a spectacular place in quality of life. I mentioned to my 17-year-old granddaughter that if she does get confirmed, that Kalista might have a spare bedroom. And
For
Maggie
visits.
I'll be there, I'm ready.
She's on it. I love it. Now, what kind of ambassador do you think she'll make? This is a tough assignment, we should say. This is not a president and a pope that always sees eye to eye, Newt.
Well, I mean, she will be between two, and I haven't even thought about trying to write Understanding Pope Francis.
That's right. Understanding Bergoglio, that's your next book.
But Understanding Trump's enough for this year. But they're two remarkable, unique people. I remember meeting with the papal nuncio preparing the visit of the president, and he was very clear that he said the most important thing that will happen is the private meeting between the two men, because they're both very strong personalities. They will both be very clear with each other. And he said, none of us can predict what will happen. And I think it was a pretty good meeting. Kalista's been working, I think the thing she's most intrigued with is working to help fight human trafficking. It really is something that we in the church are on the same side, so the United States and the church can work together. The other thing is, I mean, she's a very people-oriented person, as you know, because you know her well. I think that she will be right in the middle of the diplomatic mix. You know, there are more countries at the Vatican than any other place except the United States. They have 183 countries that have representation. So she will be able to go to receptions and lunches and breakfast and dinners. I mean, she will really be right in the middle of a miniature United Nations. And I think what people will learn about her is that she studies very hard, that she listens very well. She has a remarkable work ethic. And she loves people. Her father was a person who just adored just chatting, and she's gotten that genetic quality in her.
Well, and I always say, if all else fails, she can sing her diplomatic messages, and that will win them over. Newt Gingrich,
great to be with you.
Thank you for being here. The book is Understanding Trump by Newt Gingrich. It is perceptive and wise and has a great historical context that you will not want to miss. It's available at bookstores everywhere and online.